This is a Danish English special report on Danish-Ukraine support and growing criticism. Greetings and welcome to Danish-InfoNews TV special political edition on the Ukraine war, where politics, money, and international conflict collide. Denmark has taken a bold, unprecedented stance in support of Ukraine, sending millions in military aid, hosting Ukrainian weapons production on Danish soil, and backing massive financial loans. But not everyone is cheering. Critics argue Denmark's aggressive position toward Russia may put the country at risk, and questions are being raised about the debt traps, public opinion, and whether taxpayer money is being used wisely. This report is based on the recent DR analysis Dansk Folkeparti om regeringens Ukraine-kurs. Ingen er så konfrontatoriske over for Rusland som Danmark, which warns that Denmark's confrontational Ukraine policy does not necessarily make the country safer, according to Anders Vistesen, member of the European Parliament for Dansk Folkeparti. Stay with us as we dig deep into the political, financial, and ethical controversies shaping Denmark's role in one of the most critical conflicts in Europe today. Denmark and Ukraine, politics, war, and controversy. Denmark has constantly positioned itself at the forefront of European and Western support for Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion in February of 2022. From military aid and humanitarian programs to industrial partnerships, financial packages, and sanctions, Denmark has pursued a policy that reflects both solidarity with Ukraine and a willingness to assume strategic risk in the face of Russian aggression. However, this assertive approach has also attracted criticism domestically and internationally, highlighting the complicated connection between political, financial, and ethical considerations in Denmark's Ukraine policy. Bo Tingberg. Controversy, film, politics, and ethics. The personal dimension of Denmark's Ukraine engagement became apparent in 2025 when Bo Tingberg, husband of Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, began work on a documentary titled The Conflict, covering Ukraine and including appearances by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Tingberg's access to Zelensky, combined with his personal and professional relationship with the Danish Prime Minister, led to criticism from several quarters. Transparency International Denmark, led by Jesper Olsen, argued that Tingberg's project could be perceived as government propaganda. He emphasized that Tingberg's access to Zelensky was through his marriage, not journalistic credentials, and that private financial gains could indirectly benefit the Prime Minister. Pia Kjærsgaard, Dansk Folkeparti, echoes concerns, calling the arrangement direct camaraderie and power exploitation. Mette Frederiksen defended her husband, stating she does not interfere in his work and that Tingberg has no influence on Danish foreign policy. The Danish Film Institute provided 190,000 Danish kroner in development funding contingent on a clear storytelling perspective. Tingberg's involvement with Ukraine cinema for Victory Film Festival, a project supported by Zelensky and the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture, also drew scrutiny, particularly from cultural critics concerned about state influence over film curation. This controversy underscores a broader tension in Denmark, the intersection of personal, political, and media narratives in shaping perception of Denmark's Ukraine policy. Let's look at the military and industrial support. Denmark's military and industrial support for Ukraine is among the most significant in Europe. Financial and material aid, approximately 75 billion Danish kroner in military, humanitarian and civil assistance since 2022. Large-scale military packages. In 2023, the Danish parliament approved 1.7 billion Danish krone in support, including mine-clearing equipment, armored vehicles, field bridges, ammunition, and air defense systems. Ukrainian weapons production in Denmark. Denmark hosts a Ukrainian factory at Flyvestation Skustrup, producing high-explosive rocket fuel for long-range Flamingo missiles. This collaboration is symbolically and materially significant, demonstrating Denmark's commitment to Ukraine's long-term defense capabilities. Critics, including Dansk Folkeparti, warn that these measures increase Denmark's vulnerability to Russian attacks, including espionage, sabotage, and cyber threats, while the domestic population may be insufficiently informed about the long-term strategic costs. Financial aid, loans, and debt concerns. The EU and Denmark structure much of their support as loans, which raises concerns about Ukraine's economic sovereignty and sustainability. EU-Ukraine Facility Plan 2024 to 2027, 17 billion euros in grants and 33 billion euros in loans. Previous loans, 7.2 billion euros in 2022 and 18 billion euros in 2023. Extra loan package, 45-year term, 10 years moratorium, 18.1 billion euros from the EU. Critics such as political analyst Teresa Scavenius argue that this loan structure risks trapping Ukraine in a long-term debt spiral. The loans carry conditions requiring privatization of banks and key sectors, healthcare, energy, transport, and infrastructure, potentially channeling Ukraine's national assets to private or foreign investors. Replacement compensation loan proposal. On October 1st of 2025, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen expressed support for an EU proposal to provide a replacement or compensation loan to Ukraine based on frozen Russian assets. Ukraine would repay the loan post-war. Russia would be required to compensate for war damages. Other EU leaders, including those of Estonia and Finland, also voiced support. This initiative demonstrates Denmark's creative financial approach to sustaining Ukraine's defense and reconstruction efforts. Sanctions against Russia. Denmark implements EU sanctions directly, supplemented by national legislation. The sanctions are comprehensive, targeting financial systems, trade, and individuals. First, financial sanctions. The sanctions include asset freezes on the holdings of Russian oligarchs, officials, and central banks, totaling approximately 200 billion euros. A number of significant Russian banks are excluded from SWIFT. Transactions in Russian state securities are restricted by capital market regulations. Second, trade restrictions. Advanced systems and dual-use technology are prohibited from export. There are prohibitions on the import of revenue-generating Russian goods like steel, oil, and diamonds. Price caps on Russian oil and restrictions on LNG are partially due to EU dependence. Third, personal sanctions. Travel bans and visa restrictions apply to important Russian persons and organizations. Impact. Trade with non-sanctioning countries helps Russia partially offset the effects of sanctions, which have slowed Russian GDP growth and forced the country to use more expensive alternatives in production. Compliance is actively enforced by Danish authorities. Zelensky's visits and the European strategy. September of 2025, Zelensky visited Denmark and other European capitals to advocate for increased European financial support for military purchases, including US-made Patriot systems. Zelensky advocated for the development of Ukrainian national arms production, drawing inspiration from Denmark's Vojens facility. The strategy for self-defense is robust and long-term, and it remains unaffected by political fluctuations in the West. This reflects Ukraine's historical security concerns dating to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons for guarantees from the US, UK, and Russia, guarantees that were later violated with Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Historical and geopolitical background. The war has deep roots. Let's look at the Russian rationale, Putin's claim, NATO expansion, demilitarization, and denazification of Ukraine. Underlying causes: Ukraine's westward orientation, historical conflicts post-2014 Euromaidan, Crimea annexation, and Donbas separatism. Revanchism, nationalism, Putin's vision of a Russian world encompassing Ukraine. The international response largely condemns Russia's action as unprovoked aggression, violating international law. Denmark and EU nations continue support, but growing public fatigue and political skepticism are observed in some countries. Political debate and public opinion. Denmark, broad political and public support for Ukraine remains high. However, minor segments of the population question the cost, risks, and potential territorial concessions. Others question the transparency and effectiveness of the aid, citing corruption in Ukraine and fears of escalating conflict with Russia. Some even urge dialogue with Moscow and call for peace talks, claiming Denmark's aggressive stance risks dragging the country deeper into a geopolitical confrontation. Dansk Folkeparti emphasizes caution, highlighting risks from Denmark's confrontational stance. Vistesen warns that Denmark's position may increase exposure to Russian retaliation without guaranteeing greater security. Other European countries. Support varies with skepticism in some regions. Economic pressures, energy costs, and inflation influence public opinion and political discourse, affecting EU cohesion. USA, domestic political disagreements, especially among Republicans, influence European countries to assume greater responsibility for Ukraine. Peace and ceasefire developments. On 21st of October of 2025, a significant diplomatic shift occurred. Several European leaders and President Zelensky supported US President Donald Trump's proposal for negotiations based on the current front lines. Denmark, via Prime Minister Frederiksen and Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen, affirmed the principle that international borders cannot be changed by force. Joint statements included EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. This move indicates that even Denmark, despite its strong military and financial support, is exploring pathway to negotiated settlement, balancing humanitarian, strategic, and political realities. Conclusion. Denmark's Ukraine policy exemplifies a highly integrated approach combining military aid, equipment, training facilities. We provided financial support and loans, including compensation mechanisms. We are enforcing sanctions and applying economic pressure on Russia. Diplomatic engagement, hosting international summits, and participating in ceasefire discussions. Cultural and media dimensions, exemplified by Bo Tingberg's documentary and public discourse. While Denmark enjoys strong situational and political backing, risks remain. Exposure to Russian retaliation. Long-term economic and debt implications for Ukraine and Europe. Growing need for domestic transparency and debate on costs, risks, and ethical consideration. Denmark's approach illustrates the complex balance between moral commitment, strategic risk, and political optics in the contemporary European security landscape. That's a wrap on Danish-InfoNews TV special political edition on the Ukraine war. Denmark's bold stand, its military aid, financial strategies, and diplomatic maneuvers are making headlines and raising questions at home. Do you support Denmark's Ukraine policy, or do you think it's time to rethink the approach? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more in-depth coverage, analysis, and insider reporting on European politics, subscribe now. And hit the notification bell. Stay informed, stay critical, and stay ahead with Danish-InfoNews TV.